Good morning. I'm going to be reading this morning Galatians 4, verses 4 through 7. If you'd like to follow along, it's on page 947 in your pew Bible. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who, so that we might receive adoption as the children. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a child. And if a child, then also an heir through God.
The hardest part of preaching about Christmas is the familiarity of it. Everything we could say about it has been said many times over. For myself, after 50 Advent seasons of preaching it, I'm impressed with the diversity reflected in the New Testament about Jesus' beginnings. And not just what's said, but what is not said. Mark, our earliest gospel, omits the birth story, and he begins his gospel with the baptism of Jesus. The first gospel has no interest in Jesus' birth, or he would have said something about it. Neither does John. Rather, he hops over the baptism and the birth way back before creation morning with a mystery that we call pre-existence. How on earth you pre-exist, it's beyond me. But whatever that is, the fourth gospel gives us the loftiest view of Jesus as the Word. The Greek logos, word. Only Matthew and Luke employ birth narratives. Luke gives us Mary's perspective, and Matthew describes Joseph's, but both mention signs of heavenly approval bolstered by angelic choruses. Matthew tells us about Herod in Jerusalem and the Magi from the east. Luke reports about the innkeeper and the shepherds in the fields outside Bethlehem. In spite of the differing details, each of the birth narratives declare that heaven has intersected with earth with redemption. The only other time the birth of Jesus is mentioned comes from the pen of the Apostle Paul, who also interprets it as an act of redemption. Born, he says, under the law. From his birth, Jesus was subjected to the same legalistic system of domination that he came to redeem us from. Born of the law, born of a woman, not, I might add, of a virgin. Paul was more interested in Mary's gender than her purity. So all of this, he says, in the fullness of time. Well, what's full about it, you might ask? There's several things, no doubt. The time was ripe because religion had become a big disappointment and the government was corrupt. Roman legions tramped the roads, homage was paid to Caesar or else. All of this made time pregnant for God's Messiah. Into the face of such raw power, the apostle dared to say that is precisely when the time was full for God to send forth his Son, born of a woman. versus the mighty Romans, against all odds, as it would appear. It would have been madness then to think that after millennia, millions of people would be gathering all over this terrestrial ball to worship in the name of Mary's baby. I find it staggering that something so unpromising and so vulnerable has been so decisive, so that we measure all time against it. Everything that previously happened is called BC, and everything that's happened since we call AD, the eternal now of God's perpetual coming among us that we've come to celebrate as Christmas. Matthew calls him Jesus because he's made out of the same stuff we are, but also Emmanuel because he's made out of the same stuff God is. And he won't let either of us go. Bringing man to God and God to man, Jesus Christ is decisive. Many decisive infants have been born in this old world. An Egyptian slave girl shoved a cradle out among the bulrushes and the crocodiles of the Nile River to survive or perish, as it were. What immense issues went floating down that river in the person of baby Moses. During the mid-19th century in this country, the forces of disunion threatened our nation. In Frontier, Kentucky, a woodsman built a rough-hewn cabin on Nolan's Creek. There a baby was born who saved the Union. What would America be like today without Abraham Lincoln? A decisive baby. Or Roger Williams, what he did for religious liberty, a brand new experiment that has worked for centuries. Or Martin Luther King, there's a decisive baby who grew up to say it's about character, not colors. Decisive babies all, but none more decisive than Mary's. Anybody who can bend the date lines of history around an unpretentious stall has to be the most decisive baby on earth. He laid down the law, says Paul. He became what we are to make us like he is. Less legalistic, more loving, less transactional, more relational. And that gives us hope when things look hopeless. With babies, you never know what might happen. Around the corner in some nursery today may be a kid who will push open a new era tomorrow. The Roman Empire eventually crumbled to the ground. But to this day, multitudes still sing, "O holy child of Bethlehem, descend on us, we pray. Cast out our sin and enter in. Be born in us today." If you and I are going to trust the creative forces to which the future belongs, we have to be hoping that something newborn out there, maybe even now growing among us. Who doesn't need to hear that today? Roger Maris, who for years held the major league record for home runs in a season, was asked by a reporter, what is his secret? How was he able to hit 61 home runs? And his response was interesting. He didn't talk about power or strength, not even bat speed. He said the secret to hitting home runs was split-second timing. Two round objects coming together at just the right instance at 100 miles an hour. You realize how hard that is? The secret to hitting a home run is timing. So when Jesus Christ arrived in Bethlehem, God hit a home run. The time was right. God is never early. He's never late. He's right on time. He's the on-time God. The book of Ecclesiastes says, for everything there is a season. We know that's true. We have our seasons. In season, out of season. And this applies to our search committee. They've been looking for a year or more for a good fit for this congregation. And indeed, that is critical. But it's not all. Because also has to be taken into consideration timing. Timing is everything. In the life of the church, in the life of the prospective preacher, and God's timing. God doesn't operate on Eastern Standard Time. He operates on eternal standard time. And Jesus' birth was no accident. It was an appointment, not an accident. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So before time even began, God had set it on heaven's calendar. I like what old Yogi said. You can observe a lot by watching. Herod believed in brute force, in violence. The wise men didn't listen to Herod or Caesar or Caiaphas. They wanted to see a manger. And you note that little phrase in Matthew, they went home a different way. They didn't go back the same way they came. They were changed. So not the imperial power that loomed large and seemed permanent. Rather, they saw what God was doing in an infant. And that's the biblical mark of wisdom. Those who followed a star till it stood over a place where something born of a woman lay. Each time the world faces an impasse, a child is born and crops up, and a new way opens to unsuspecting hopes. Jesus was the split-second timing where the hopes and fears of all the years have met in thee tonight. The fullness of time. Before the time became full, a lot of plain people had to come first. Isaiah the prophet was one of them who foresaw a time when the wolf shall lie down with the lamb. And John the Baptist would preach about preparing the way to make the crooked places straight. Joseph of Nazareth was caught between a rock and a hard place after being illumined in a dream to marry a woman who had a baby that he knew was not his, decided to swallow his pride and take Mary as his wife against all odds. Mary, Mary, and the Messiah will come, and he did, and it came. And Mary herself, what if she just said, what? Say what? No way, Jose. You know what she said? Let it be to me according to thy word. Great, great words. What about the scholars in the temple who listened to his questions? Or the friends at Bethany who supported him when he was down? Or the 12 who left everything they had to follow him? Multitudes of people with God working through each of them enable Jesus to be great. No decisive baby got that way. without oodles of others to look out for them along the way. Consequently, Jesus grew up and said, "Greater things than I have done, you will do." Think about that. The confidence he put in the 12. Everybody is important. God has something for all of us to do. You never know what will contribute to the fullness of time, except in retrospect. I don't think any of us in worship here today would disagree that Christ is decisive. The question is he decisive for you? That's the rub. He was to the shepherds, but not to those at the inn. He was to the Magi, but not to the political and religious authorities in Jerusalem and Rome. It's that way still, isn't it? For some, Jesus is absolutely decisive. But for the vast majority, he's not. Santa Claus carries more weight than Jesus, pun intended. Well, try to find a parking space over at the mall. That's what's decisive for modern Americans. Christmas is not about who comes down the chimney, but who comes down from heaven. Santa brings us gifts, but Jesus asks us to deny ourselves, to take up our cross, and follow him. That's all we can do, because God gave us a Jesus we can follow, but not control. While Rome was busy making history, Christ came and Rome missed it. While Jerusalem was busy keeping the law over at Solomon's temple, God pitched his fleshly tent on straw in a stable under a star, and the world never noticed that the time was full. It didn't skip a lick as the most momentous occurrence in history happened right under their noses. In the fullness of time, the world was still reeling in the wake of all the greats. Alexander the Great, Herod the Great, Augustus the Great, but they weren't all that great. They were just powerful. I'll tell you what's great. It's a great shame that the world overlooks Mary's little lamb, the lamb that shepherds us. The world still overlooks him, and I know you. I know you won't. Gracious God, our prayer this Advent season is for those who are busy and preoccupied, like the innkeeper, that they may know the peace that comes from a genuine act of hospitality. We pray for those like Herod who have power, that they may use it with goodwill. We pray for those who are poor and lonely and cold like the shepherds, that they may hear the good news. And we pray for ourselves who need encouragement and peace in this starlit season on this day of all days and all the rest of the days of our lives. Amen.